What's going on, TikTok family? It's your boy, Pastor Wes. I am back after the Thanksgiving break. I'm ready to do our weekly Bible study as we typically do here on TikTok. I got a good one for you today. It's coming from the book of Luke, chapter 14. I'm reading verses 1 through 6 in the New Living Translation. One Sabbath day, Jesus went to eat dinner in the home of a leader of the Pharisees, and the people were watching him closely. There was a man there whose arms and legs were swollen. Jesus asked the Pharisees and experts in religious law, is it permitted in the law to heal people on the Sabbath day or not? When they refused to answer, Jesus touched the sick man and healed him and sent him away. Then he turned to them and said, which of you doesn't work on the Sabbath? If your son or your cow falls into a pit, don't you rush to get them out? Again, they could not answer. I got to tell you something about the Pharisees. The Pharisees would often butt heads with Jesus on a number of different things. There were things that Jesus said and did that the Pharisees just disagreed with. And there was no issue that they disagreed with him more on than the issue of the Sabbath. You know, in the Old Testament, in Genesis, we read of God creating everything that we see around us in 6 days and resting on the seventh. And in the 10 commandments that Moses brought to the Israelite people, one of those commandments said to observe the Sabbath and to keep it holy. And Pharisees would interpret that scripture, interpret that law as you can't do anything. Not only should you not go to work, but you shouldn't lift a finger to do chores around the house. You shouldn't pluck grain from your yard. You shouldn't even lift a finger to cook. There was all these things that they started adding into the law. This is what we call legalism. When you insert man-made laws and you elevate them to the level of Scripture. You start saying that these man-made rules now are the same thing as Scripture, that if you violate these man-made rules, then you're somehow violating Scripture. And Jesus came, he was like, man, we're off of all that. That's not what we're doing here. And Jesus would butt heads with the Pharisees constantly about this. And so when we get to the text that I shared, he sees somebody who is sick, and it just happens to be the Sabbath. And Jesus asks them a question. Is it unlawful to heal somebody on the Sabbath? Now, here's the thing, right? If they say no, then they're not showing mercy, which is also something that God asks for. God says that I desire mercy and not sacrifice. That's also in the Old Testament. So if they say no, then they're not extending mercy. But if they say yes, then they'll realize the hypocrisy in their man-made rules. So Jesus was constantly putting these folks into I guess you can call it a chokehold. He was just kind of putting them in a bind, putting them into a box where they really had no solutions for how they could respond. Jesus demonstrates that even today we experience in the church people who try to add their own interpretations and put their own man-made laws and rules and regulations on top of Scripture, to layer it on top of Scripture. And what it does is it causes people to feel as though they cannot come to the throne of grace. They can't step into the doors of the church. We often make people feel like they have to be perfect in order for them to come to church. And that's not what God is asking us to do. And so if you are engaging in legalism, where you are causing for people to feel as though they have to be perfect, they have to do everything right in order for them to come to church or feel welcome in church, you are engaging in the same thing that Pharisees were doing, which was legalism, man-made rules to make people feel less than, to make them feel like they weren't worthy of God's grace and mercy. And so I just think that as we read this scripture, and there are a number of other ones in the Gospels that talk about this issue of the Sabbath, you know, Jesus makes sure that he reminds them that Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. In other words, we need to be flexible enough to engage in compassion over the rigidity of these laws, these man-made rules and laws that they had. And so there's a lot for us to really take away from this. But my overarching thing is, let us not be engaged in legalism. There are certain ways for us to look at Scripture and allow it to free us of the things that often hold us down. Let us not use Scripture to hold people down, but allows Scripture to be something that sets people free. That's what Jesus came to do, was to set captives free. And when we use Scripture to subjugate people, or we add layers of our own interpretation and things that are just theologically wrong, we end up binding people rather than freeing them. And so I hope that as you read the text, as you study Scripture more, look for the ways in which Scripture frees us, not for the ways in which we can bind people with Scripture. I hope that helps. You guys take care and be blessed.